Hello and welcome to Beyond Hydration, Heat Adaptation for Athletes. Thought this one was particularly valid given the heat wave we're going through this summer. Some interesting things about the heat. We've seen dehydration driving DNFs at gravel races. It seems like every year it's the warmest year on record. Forbes magazine had something about what that means for the sports. Outdoor stuff says massive shit for outdoor sports. On the left, you have global average surface temperature, heat waves in Idaho. I mean, whoever thought of that? So anyway, point being is hot summers are here for a long time. So we should probably talk about how to get you as an athlete to better perform in a hot summer. So heat adaptation for athletes. So we're going to talk about what a hot environment is. Why does that matter for health and performance, kind of physiological and mental adaptations to heat. And then we're going to talk about becoming better adapted to heat, some performance implications. All the while, we're going to close some research to practice gap. And hopefully by the end, you're better able to manage yourself for the hot summer ahead. So what is a hot or extreme environment? It's any combination of conditions that add heat stress to your body. That extreme heat stress can overwhelm your body's coping mechanisms, leading to a variety of serious conditions that can go just from loss of performance all the way to heat stroke and anything in between. Typically, we'll say something with a real feel of 91 is an extreme caution. 91 degrees plus 60% humidity. That's getting real nasty. Things you look at is air temperature, humidity, kind of breeze or air movement, and then solar radiation can influence it as well. That's just sunny or cloudy. Hot environment is a continuum. So this is a temperature and relative humidity kind of graph that shows you what the heat index would be. So when people talk about a dry heat, so even like 100 degrees with relative humidity of 40% is only in the danger zone, whereas 100 degrees with a relative humidity of 60%, which is kind of the borderline of like 60% humidity is getting it to be uncomfortable. That's firmly in the extreme danger zone. So take a look at this. You can kind of get an idea about why it can feel so gross even at like 84 degrees and muggy. So thinking about dangers of heat exhaustion or of heat related illness. First one is heat exhaustion, has all these things associated with it. Take a look. In particular, the things to think about are what to do, and that's move to a cool place, loosen clothes, try and bring down your core temperature, and sip some water. So heat exhaustion occurs when your body loses excess amounts of water and salt, typically from sweating. If left untreated, heat exhaustion can evolve into heat stroke. Things with heat stroke is, again, move the person to a cooler place, help them cool down, says do not give them anything to drink. But because heat stroke is a serious medical emergency that occurs when your body is unable to control its internal temperature. So on one hand, you've lost a lot of sweat, and that's causing the problem. This one is just you have too much heat built up in you. They're usually, there's a lot of overlap there. So usually the sweating and the heat stroke are kind of related, and we'll show you why. Impact of heat adaptation. So you get performance improvements, improves thermoregulatory ability. So what's that mean? Keeps core temperatures lower, earlier onset of sweating, and then you sweat a lot more. We're going to get back to sweating. Don't worry. When you're heat adapted, you'll see some improvements in performance physiology. So if you're not heat adapted, you typically see in a study 16% drop in time trial output versus an 18-watt gain in time trial output when you are heat adapted. So it alters thermal perception. So your mind kind of becomes trained to not interpret the warmer temperatures as feeling hot, but they'll feel cooler even if it's the same temperature. But first, a little bit about how we got to this webinar. This is kind of a pyramid of the quality of evidence in scientific studies. And there's a lot of details on the left here, and then on the right, you can kind of see that pyramid. For this podcast, I only looked at that top tier, so critical appraisal studies. So evidence-based practice guidelines, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. I did get into some case studies and some cohort studies, but those are for very, very specific things and not really looking at kind of the big picture. But for the most part, we kept to that top layer of the pyramid. And that kind of feeds into our evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice, we take the evidence from the science that's out there, and we combine it with our clinical experience or our coaching experience and our personal expertise, along with client perspectives and knowledge and understanding about how your clients feel about things. And we combine all that, and it gives us evidence-based practice. That's kind of why we're all here today, to help give you a better understanding about what the best practices are. So negative impact of heat on performance, it definitely degrades your performance. Typically, that's rooted in elevated core temperatures and feeling uncomfortable. Keep in mind that dissipation of heat is paramount to maintaining performance in hot weather. Humans are only about 20% efficient, meaning 80% of the energy we use is lost as heat. If you remember those old school incandescent light bulbs where they put out a bunch of light, but you can't touch them because they're super, super hot. We're definitely a more efficient version of that, and we are a version of that. So as your core temperature goes up, it changes a lot of things in your body. Central nervous system kind of makes your brain think it's overheated. Brain starts to think it's hot. I need to slow down. Everything slows down. Reactions slow down. Decision making becomes worse. Your brain just can't think fast enough. Cardiovascularly, like blood demands increased everywhere. Your skin wants more blood to shunt the heat to the outside world. Your muscles need the blood to start to keep exercising. And all of that means you need to have a lot more blood in your body via plasma. And as plasma volume begins to drop, you start sweating a bunch, then your body starts making a bunch of compromises. Muscle action in general, when from a negative impact of heat, becomes a lot more strenuous, which means you fatigue more quickly. So it increases the rate of glycogen breakdown and the accumulation of metabolic or metabolites. Hyperthermia from the environment reduces time to exhaustion. Again, that's going back to that central nervous system. And hyperthermia from environment reduces muscular force generation. That's the peripheral nervous system. That's different from when you warm up because of the way that you're generating the heat and the way your body feels the heat. All right, so more benefits of heat adaptation. It is a piece of the whole athlete puzzle, okay? This will get you maybe an extra handful of percentage points if you're not fit enough to be competitive and wherever you are competing or wherever you want to perform. You're not going to be there simply by heat adapting. It is very trainable. It is very effective at improving your existing performance, and is very effective for all competitions. Even if you're in cold weather, being heat adapted helps. Fun fact, only about 15% of athletes become fully heat adapted. We're going to talk about what that means. About 48% of those athletes have suffered a heat-related illness, but only about 52% of the athletes from this study actually have a game day strategy to become heat adapted and to handle heat. Benefits of heat adaptation, it's multi-systemic, so you have cardiovascular benefits, blood benefits, performance benefits, VO2 benefits, brain, gut, heart, brain and gut benefits like heart protection. Definitely you learn to sweat a lot more and you sweat a lot earlier. And the list goes on, right? Point being is that it's very much a multi-systemic reaction that benefits all aspects of yourself and for sport. Let's talk about showing you where the degradation to heat adaptation comes and why you want to get better. So this is from an athlete that I coach, and in the bottom right, so this is a power duration curve where the separated by temperatures. And at the bottom right, you'll see when this athlete was not heat adapted, and you're going to see a 20% power drop at for a 20-minute output. So it's your typical FTP test, 20% power drop at 91 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I thought was a great example of why you want to become heat adapted. Fast forward a few weeks, that athlete was heat adapted. We did the exact same test again. And in the top left, you're going to see what that same power duration curve looked like when the athlete was actually heat adapted. So, benefits of adaptation, and how we get there and where they're all rooted. So all adaptations to heat are predicated by an ability for your body to more effectively thermoregulate. This is primarily accomplished through sweating. So sweating is the #1 way that you cool down. There are other ways, but anytime you get a bunch of water on your skin that evaporates and cools you, like that's the way to go, but it costs you water. So that's where we talk about hydration. For the very first time, we're going to talk about it. So negative impact of heat, effects of dehydration. So this chart, love it. It looks at percentage of maximal performance on the left, the y-axis, so up and down, as you lose body mass to dehydration. So if you look, you'll see at a 1% loss of body mass to dehydration, you lose about 4%. At 3% loss of body mass to dehydration, you lose 15%. I don't know about everybody else, but I always think that anytime you can maintain that 100% ability, it's always going to be better. No one wants to go into a competition saying, like, I'm 15% off right now. Looking at hydration, first thing we have to find out is how to measure your own sweat rate. So this is kind of a at-home test that we can do. So weigh yourself nude, preferably, or in your skivvies before you go and exercise. Record that number. Record how much you urinate during the ride. Best guess. You don't have to, take a measuring cup out there or anything. And then record how much you drink during the ride. You should know how many ounces of fluid your bottles hold. If not, figure that out. And then weigh yourself at the end of the ride, same thing you were wearing at the beginning. So then you're going to do some math. So pre-ride weight, fluids consumed, fluids expelled through urination, and then your post-ride weight. And that's going to give you a total weight difference. And then divide that by your ride time. And that'll give you your fluid loss per hour, right? So minimize stoppage time on these rides. And you're going to want to repeat that 2 or 3 times on days, 2 or 3 times on an easy day, 2 or 3 times on a medium kind of training day, and 2 or 3 times on a hard day or race day. And then this will give you a really good approximation of how much you're actually sweating. Elite athletes in the lab have been clocked at 1.5 to 2.5 liters per hour of sweat loss. Then over on the right, at the Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista, they have these little placards which kind of say, what color is your urine, and then it gives you some little information about what you should do to correct that issue. That's in every bathroom that I saw when I was at the Olympic Training Center, so I had to take a photo of it. All right, so exactly how much do you drink? So generally speaking, you can consume the same amount of fluids that you are sweating. So more is more. So I would say when it's hot, get twice your normal feeds because you're probably not drinking enough. And no one ever says at the end of a hard race day when it's hot outside or a hard training day, man, I really wish I wouldn't have drank all that water. I've never heard that muttered. Thinking 1 cold bottle every 40 to 60 minutes is probably a good place to start. It definitely won't match a sweat rate of 2.5 liters per hour, but it's a good place to start. Keep in mind that you have, just like with your nutrition and with your training, you have to train your gut to be able to process this much fluids. So how much water is how much water, right? So these are 3 common water bottle sizes. On the left is a standard bottle you'll see on everyone's bike in the Tour de France and whatever. In the middle is a big bottle, we'll call it, and then on the right is a 1 liter bottle. There's a few companies that make this, but it's a 1 liter bottle, right? So trying to combine, seeing what the combinations are. So say we're trying to get 2 liters an hour. So that's 3 of those size bottles, right? Or if you just want to have 2 bottles, that's 2 of those is 1.4 liters an hour. So it's definitely not 2 liters, but people think like, oh, that's a lot of water. And it is, right? But if you want to get to 2 liters, you got to add that 3rd bottle. So now you're carrying 3 bottles. Another way to get there is just have 2 of these 1-liter bottles, right? So those are big bottles. They don't fit in all the frames, but there's still a lot of water. So thinking about an example of sweat rate and hydration. So if your sweat rate's 2 liters an hour, in 1 hour, if you have, this is comparing these 2 water bottle sizes. In 1 hour, you would drink about 0.6 liters or 20 ounces versus 2 liters of the big bottles, right? So after an hour, you're 20 ounces behind. After 3 hours, you're 60 ounces behind, or 3.8 pounds. After 5 hours, so now we're getting into like extreme distances or like long, super long races. Now you're about 0.8 of a gallon of water behind, so that's roughly 6 pounds. Or if you've been drinking these 2-liter bottles every hour, then you still have no deficit. And then after an 8-hour, something like an epic gravel race, now you're 1.25 gallons behind if you've been drinking 2 of these bottles an hour, and you're sweating 2 liters an hour. So that's a lot. A lot of people can't sweat 2 liters an hour for 8 hours straight. But I wanted to make the point that when you have the chance to take a big bottle versus a not as big bottle and it's hot outside, always opt for the bigger bottle. Because going back to this slide, you don't want to be hitting that 3% body mass loss to water. Just not a good place to be. Because now, if you think about percentage of maximal performance, it's taking 15% off your FTP and it's taking 15% off of your 5-minute surge that you can do up a hard climb or hard hill, right? So it's taking 15% off everything. So let's talk about heat adaptation and how to get used to it. It's a training stress, just like any other training stress, it should be accounted for, right? So generally speaking, you have intensity of the heat plus the exercise intensity, bring in a duration, number of exposures, can be multiple sessions a day, an intensity ceiling, about 101 degrees core temperature. And that gives you this general idea about how to calculate how much heat stress you have, right? So we'll typically weave heat adaptation, this kind of training, into training like 1 to 3 mesocycles prior to a major event. Some professional athletes will do a big block of heat adaptation early in the season, and then they'll do maintenance doses throughout the year, right? So that they maintain that all season. But for the most part, you can kind of build that adaptation in right when you need it and not have to worry about it for the rest of the season, right? So there's 3 ways we're going to talk about this. One is acute adaptation. Short term takes about 14 days or less. About 2 to 20 hours of athlete time. I tend to think like 20 hours of athlete time. Chronic adaptation is long term, 5 weeks, 40 hours of athlete time. And then we're going to talk about heat alleviation. And that's just what you do on game day to stay as cool as possible, right? Again, going back to the benefits of a heat adaptation are all these multi-systemic things. So no one system will be affected. It's going to affect all of these in some way to some degree, right? And then looking at that and how these adaptation methods affect different parts of your body and your performance. So this is a chart that looks at percentage for adaptation percentage on day 1, and then versus day 1 as you go through this stage of heat acclimation, like how are these different variables affected? So you're going to see, first thing, there's not a whole lot going on that's noticeable until day 3. Usually by day 6, your plasma volume, which is your sweat reservoir, will tend to peak by then. That happens pretty darn fast. That's great. Your sweat rate typically peaks somewhere around day 11, so around 2 to 2 weeks period. So at that point, a lot of people think like you're pretty darn heat adapted, right? Exercise capacity will go up gradually the entire time. A couple of things that I want to point out is that thermal comfort tends to peak out at about day 6 or 7, That's how your brain interprets how hot it is. You're going to feel more comfortable in hot weather, right? Core temperature and your skin temperature will both drop. So at around day 6 or 7, you're going to have those core temperatures drop, and that's going to be another really good place to be. And talking about like cardiac effects of heat adaptation, your heart rate, your resting heart rate will drop, or your exercising heart rate will drop as well for the same amount of work. Thinking about thermal perception. So this is a cool chart that they asked a bunch of questions. They asked some questions to a bunch of people and said, how hot does this feel in different temperatures, whether they were acclimated or not acclimated to hot, humid climates. And this is kind of your overlap. So when people say they're comfortable versus, it is all the shaded part. So you can see that when they are acclimated, you get this shift to warmer and warmer temperatures, right? And then on the right, I put in a conversion chart because it's all in Celsius. And no, we're in America, so no one knows how much a Celsius degree is. So looking at acute heat adaptation, I'm going to talk about acclimatization versus acclimation. There's a lot of overlap there. You can mix and match them. Generally speaking, this is in the literature a way that they had of basically trying to define it and put it into little boxes to make it easier to talk about. So all of these methods have the same goal, which is to increase core temperature moderately to stimulate thermoregulation improvements, so sweating without causing heat illness, right? So we're going to have, first one we're going to talk about, I guess, is acclimatization versus acclimation. So acclimatization, so think about climate. It's in the natural environment. Typically, it's in like a 1 to 4 week mesocycles. It's how you're going to kind of block this off. Generally, it has to be above 25 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit to get this kind of stimulus that you would want. Specific training sessions should be completed in conditions that you're going to compete in. So you're going to do more of this like riding when it's hot and training when it's hot. Not all sessions are dependent. Not all sessions and are dependent upon coach guidance. Be mindful of your core temperature, so keep it below 39 degrees Celsius. It should be executed in about 3 to 8 training sessions per week, 30 to 90 minutes at a time. So, and then again, you're training in the hotter or hottest part of the day. Not necessarily doing maximal efforts, but you are training. And this could be the excuse you need for a training camp, say for spring break or whatever, or you just, you wait for summer and wait for everything to get just scorching hot. Acclimation is outside of the natural environment. So that's where now you're talking about being inside like chambers. So temperature controlled chambers, anything just not outside the natural environment. So usually 4 to 14 day microcycles, can take multiple cycles. Goal is to reach a core temperature of 38 to 39 degrees Celsius, 30 to 90-minute sessions. Some ways to do it are ergometry. So your ergometry, the way to think about that is Swift writing. Allows like granular prescription and monitoring for athlete metrics. So like core temperature, room temperature to assess the load of that heat session, right? Another one that's pretty popular is a fixed intensity. So you're just going to park your exercise or your training at, say, 50 to 65% VO2 max for 30 to 60 minutes. And then wherever the core temperature goes, it's going to go. Like keep it, make sure it's safe, obviously. 3 to 8 sessions a week. And then you have isothermic controlled training. So that's when you're going to be kind of locking the training to the core temperature. And then you will change the output regardless of what happens. Regardless of what the output is, your core temperature stays the same. So again, like 20 to 60 minutes is what the literature says, 3 to 8 sessions a week. So there's a lot of things in common there, basically. Somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes, between 3 and 8 sessions a week kind of gets the job done. And then we're going to have like self-regulated for acclimation. So altitude will change at a self-regulated pace depending upon like how it feels. It's easy to execute. It's not as effective as the other ones. It's much easier as far as like an emotional buy-in from the athlete. I do want to touch on that adding extra clothing and riding outside to increase perceived thermal load. It's not super effective in cycling. I think people like to do it for good reason. I feel like if you feel it works and that helps, not super effective, probably because there's just so much wind when you're riding a bike outside. And it can be counterproductive. All of these can be counterproductive if the athlete pushes themselves too hard. So keep the goal of the session in mind. And the goal is not to melt yourself from the inside out. Some other ways we had to look at acclimation is passive, which is no additional training loads. So you're talking about heat chambers, so saunas, both steam and infrared. Overdressing on warm days. So running, you can overdress on warm days, or just being outside on hot days when you normally wouldn't be. Hot water immersion, so that's like a hot tub. It's more effective when it's combined with active strategies, which takes us to below where it says passive follow-up for an active session. So it's reported to be the most effective. It's also got the highest stress load. You do these same things with the passive strategies like heat chambers, only you do it immediately following a training session or a training ride. If you're getting into this the sauna and you feel hot, too hot, or you're dizzy or lightheaded, like get out because it's time. That's when you get into the whole safety thing. And then we're going to talk about chronic heat adaptation for our final point here. And this one is not talked about a lot, but it's primarily defined by the hematological adaptations. So that's blood adaptations. Requires time, a lot of time, weeks of exposure for stimulation, and to allow for red blood cell formation. So you're going to get more red blood cells out of this deal. It's not the same as altitude training, but similar performance gains are realized, and there is a fair amount of overlap. So or cross compatibility. So it will work for altitude competitions to some degree. And in this 5-week or more session of 1 hour a day, 5 days a week was what the study says, you're going to gain about 3% gain in hemoglobin mass. So hemoglobin is the part that actually binds the oxygen molecule in your red blood cell. And that leads to an 18-watt gain in time trial performance. That's a really, really big deal. And that's why you do it takes about 5 weeks. Hardly anyone ever gets to this chronic heat adaptation point because they don't do maintenance sessions. And as we'll see next, the rate of decay for this heat adaptation status is about 2.5% loss per day of non-heat exposure. So I know for all you folks in like Houston and in the South that's going through a heat wave right now, you just want to stay in air conditioning, but staying in air conditioning all the time is going to give you 2.5% off every day. And this chart on the left kind of shows you the rate of decay for all these studies that happen. Maintenance doses for heat acclimation can delay this more or less indefinitely. It takes about 3 sessions a week, 2 to 3 sessions a week, I guess, is what they've shown. And finally, we're going to talk about heat alleviation on game day. So these are strategies and techniques used on immediately prior to and during competition to help the athlete maintain core temperature. So very intensive logistically, requires a lot of support from team, staff, friends, parents, partners, the random person you find on the street that can help you out. So first thing we're going to talk about is pre-cooling. So meta-analyses is like 21 studies show that pre-cooling helps preserve hot weather performance. Most of these were cycling, some were running. Did a combination of ingesting cold water, ice slurries, have ice packs, and wore ice vests. So mostly limited to shorter events as it was defined in literature. That's almost like every criterion, short track race, a lot of events in cycling are 60 minutes or less. So this is very much effective for that. Let's see. Another thing we want to talk about is staying in air conditioning. Pre-cooling starts in the hotel. Take extra care to be dehydrated. You should probably do this 2 or 3 days before competition as far as hydration goes. Morning pre-competition rides, kind of complete them before your temperature becomes elevated or extreme, because they're supposed to be like the morning relaxed chill ride, not the super hot death march. And ingestion of ice slurries. So that's basically slushies minus the sugar and all that stuff. You can do right up until the start of the race. And then supplementary ice in the clothing gives you about 10 to 15 minutes per ice sock or whatever of helping out with that on-rated cooling process, right? During the event, I would say hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. Remember your sweat rate. It's usually pretty high. It's a lot higher than you think it is. Always use drink mix. In particular, you want the sodium. Always better than water. But if you have to choose between water or nothing, like water's going to win. Something wet in effect. Cold drinks are great. Ice slurries, those insulated bottles are awesome. Again, ice socks and other auxiliary cooling methods are fantastic. This thing on the right with the Slurpees, by the way, 7-Eleven days coming. So, enjoy that. Like 7-Elevens have their Slurpees on sale those days. So those two studies I circled just to use the ice slurries, which I thought were always fun. So then looking at more heat adaptation post-event, the goal is to bring your core temperature back to normal as quick as you can. And in this one, it says this thing on the graph on the right looked at like cold water immersion versus ice water immersion. So it shouldn't be a surprise that colder water will help you. The colder the water is, the more heat you can dissipate into it. So it'll help bring your core temperature down, right? But is it comfortable? So I'm not a huge ice water guy. I don't like being that cold. So I'm more of a cool water immersion, which is kind of in between the mock treatment and the cold. But it works for me. So something beats nothing. So also rehydrate. ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, says 16 ounces per 30 minutes until you've regained 150% of the fluid lost. So if you lose a gallon is about 8 pounds. So if you lose 8 pounds of water, you're going to want to drink about 12 pounds of fluids at 16 ounces for every 30 minutes until you hit that point. It just takes time and you have to make sure you focus on it, right? It's just another step in the process as an athlete of being that whole athlete that's ready for competition. So I want to talk about cramping real quick. Quick sidebar. It's long established to debunk the link between electrolytes and cramping. Exercise, the current models say that exercise that's related to muscle cramping originates in the motor neuron and is a result of nerve fatigue and muscle damage from lack of fitness. And that's in quotes because that's what it says in the study. There's some like hot spices, so spice TRP channel agonists, so like the hot shot drinks, those little shots, and are a good way to stop cramping if you can get to them. And then a combination of hydration and relative intensity when you're cold also have a role to play in that as well. Recovering from performance in hot conditions. Again, this is just a fun flow chart that basically says like, get hydrated and then get your core temperature back to normal, right? And then all these fantastic things happen. So finally, adapting to training in the heat. Remember that competition still requires each of us to reach that upper echelon of our physical ability. Nationwide, that ability is relatively consistent, and thus, regardless of weather, there's still demand for a high level of performance. And the need for high power efforts has not diminished in sport. In fact, it has grown. As more and more athletes become closer and closer in ability level at the higher levels, there's more and more hard efforts needed. So that's about it. Finally, sorry, one more. Trying to escape the heat and train when it's not hottest, but just warm. So moderate heat can give you the same benefits and allow for higher training stress. Think about, if you're in the Midwest, those dawn patrol rides where you see the sun come up and everyone puts them on Instagram. Those are good because it's not 100 degrees yet. It's only 80 degrees, right? Also consider indoor training if necessary to get that exposure at the highest intensities. I have athletes that live in Phoenix and Tucson and Las Vegas, and in the summer, it's called like Las Vegas winter, basically. They train indoors to get these super high intensities because they generate too much heat outside, but they're traveling somewhere east or somewhere cooler. So they need to be able to get those high power efforts, right? And then maintain exposure to heat, those maintenance doses to get those, to keep those beneficial adaptations, and never, ever stop with hydration, ever. It's definitely becomes part of the job. So hopefully you learned kind of what is a hot environment, why does it matter, physiological and mental adaptations to heat, and how to become better adapted to the heat, some performance implications. Hopefully I helped close like the research to practice gap for you, so you kind of get a better idea of what to do. You'll be able to better manage yourself the hot summer ahead. If you have any questions, just hit me up, and hopefully you'll have a great summer.